The Fashion Show Fatality. Chapter 1, The Runway Turns Deadly. The grand hall of the Palais Garnier glittered as though 1,000 stars had descended upon Paris. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, their light bouncing across the gilt-framed mirrors and marble columns. The space, normally home to the world's most celebrated operas, had been transformed into a cathedral of couture. Rows of velvet seats faced the long runway, which gleamed beneath a narrow track of stage lights. The hushed murmur of anticipation, the clinking of champagne glasses, and the low hum of multilingual conversation gave the air a nervous electricity. Paris Fashion Week was in full swing, and this show, the centerpiece of the season, promised to outshine them all. Jessica Fletcher adjusted the elegant silk scarf about her shoulders as she took her seat in the second row. Though more accustomed to book launches and library fundraisers than couture galas, she had accepted the invitation with equal parts curiosity and trepidation. Her friend, American designer Margaret Vaughn, had insisted she attend. Jessica, Margaret had said with her characteristic flair, fashion is storytelling with fabric. You of all people should appreciate that. And so here she was, notebook discreetly tucked into her evening bag, prepared to observe and absorb. A ripple of excitement spread through the crowd as the orchestra struck its first dramatic notes. Spotlights dimmed, then swelled again, illuminating the entrance archway. The first model emerged, tall, poised, wrapped in a shimmering gown of pale silver that caught the light like moonlit water. Gasps and appreciative whispers followed her down the runway. Others followed in succession, angular suits, feathered capes, gowns stitched with gemstones so fine they seemed unreal. Jessica allowed herself to be swept up in the spectacle, noting how each garment told its own story, some of mystery, others of audacity. But when Camille Rousseau appeared, the energy shifted. Camille was no ordinary model, she was the face of French couture, a national treasure, and the evening's undisputed star. At just 25, she had conquered runways from Milan to New York, her presence commanding, her grace unmatched. Tonight, she wore a gown the color of midnight, its hem patterned with intricate, hand-stitched constellations. Each stitch glimmered like a captured star, and the entire garment seemed to float as she walked. The audience erupted in applause, a rare breach of runway etiquette, as cameras flashed like lightning in a storm. Jessica found herself studying not just the gown but the woman. Camille's beauty was dazzling, yet there was a fragility behind her eyes, a tension in her shoulders that suggested strain. Jessica knew that look. She had seen it in actors before a premiere, in politicians before a debate. Pressure, tightly coiled, threatening to snap. Still, Camille carried herself with grace, reaching the runway's end, pausing with a practiced tilt of her chin. And then, without warning, she faltered. At first it was subtle, a wobble of her ankle, a momentary loss of rhythm. The audience leaned forward, thinking perhaps it was an intentional flourish, a daring bit of theater. But as Camille's hand flew to her throat, clutching at her necklace, it was clear this was no performance. Her eyes widened, glassy with panic. The applause dissolved into sharp intakes of breath as her knees buckled. The midnight gown crumpled beneath her as she collapsed to the gleaming runway floor. Gasps echoed through the hall. A man shouted in French. Flashbulbs, disturbingly, continued to pop as some photographers mistook tragedy for art. Jessica was already on her feet, pushing past stunned guests. "Call for a doctor," someone cried, but Jessica knew the urgency in the girl's paling face, the slackness of her limbs. Camille Rousseau was dying before their eyes. By the time the first medic reached her, it was too late. The model's stillness told the story plainly. The orchestra had ceased, leaving the hall in a dreadful silence broken only by murmurs of disbelief. Guests rose, some pressing hands to their mouths, others ushering companions toward the exits. Margaret Vaughn appeared at Jessica's side, pale with shock. "My God, Jessica. She's gone." Jessica's gaze moved to the gown, the exquisite midnight creation now twisted on the floor. The hem's embroidered stars glittered innocently under the lights, but Jessica's instinct whispered otherwise. Death on a runway was no accident. She crouched, as close as the flurry of medics would allow, and her sharp eyes noted something peculiar, the faintest discoloration near the stitching of the bodice. A residue, subtle, but present. Not spilled makeup or champagne. Something applied deliberately. "Poison," Jessica murmured under her breath. Margaret's head snapped toward her. "What did you say?" Jessica straightened, her expression grave. Camille Rousseau did not collapse from nerves or exhaustion. That dress was her death sentence. She glanced toward the backstage area, where designers, assistants, and fellow models stood frozen, their faces masks of shock, horror, or guilt. Someone turned couture into a weapon tonight. Paris police quickly swarmed the scene, sealing the exits, questioning guests, and ushering the audience into waiting areas. Jessica, ever the calm in chaos, observed quietly, her mind already sorting through possibilities. The gown had been central to Camille's final walk. It had touched her skin, clung to her frame, carried the residue Jessica suspected was toxic. But who had the opportunity to tamper with it? And why target Camille, the shining jewel of French fashion? As she was escorted with the other guests into a side salon, Jessica's eyes swept over the crowd of designers. She noted Alain Dubois, the brooding genius known for his temper and uncompromising vision. Beside him stood Sylvie Marchand, Camille's rumored rival, her lips pressed thin in what looked suspiciously like satisfaction. Across the room, Henri Beaumont, head tailor for the house hosting the show, wrung his hands, his face ashen. The circle of suspects had already begun to form. Margaret clutched Jessica's arm. "This is going to destroy the industry. A model dying on the runway? And poisoned, no less? The press will devour us." Jessica patted her friend's hand gently but kept her eyes locked on the runway doors now guarded by officers. "Then it's fortunate, Margaret, that I came prepared to observe. Because what we witnessed tonight was not merely a tragedy, it was a carefully sewn murder. And murders, as you know, have a habit of unraveling under close examination." The whispers in the room grew, a storm of speculation and fear. But Jessica Fletcher's mind was already threading its way through the labyrinth, following the stitch that might lead to the truth. Chapter 2, Sketches and Suspicions. The side salon of the Palais Garnier had been transformed into an impromptu holding chamber. Velvet curtains muted the sounds of chaos from outside, while uniformed officers posted at the doors kept the anxious crowd contained. The atmosphere was suffocating, a mix of perfume, sweat, and raw fear. Designers in immaculate suits and gowns whispered furiously among themselves, while assistants darted about like unsettled sparrows, their clipboards clutched to their chests as though they might shield them from suspicion. Jessica Fletcher sat in a high-backed chair near the window, her notebook open on her lap. Though the police had taken initial statements, she knew enough about crime scenes to understand that the first impressions often carried truths the later reports would bury. Her pen scratched softly across the page as she noted mannerisms, snippets of conversation, and expressions half hidden behind practiced composure. Margaret Vaughn, her American friend, hovered close. "Jessica, the police are treating this like an accident," she whispered, her voice tight with worry. They're saying Camille could have had a heart condition. But you saw her. You think it was poison? Jessica's eyes flicked toward a knot of designers clustered in the corner. Alain Dubois gestured dramatically, his hands slicing through the air like blades, while Sylvie Marchand looked on with an expression of cool disdain. Margaret, Jessica replied softly, I've lived long enough to know when death wears a costume. What I saw wasn't an ailment, it was sabotage. That dress was tampered with. She tapped her pen against the notebook. Tell me, who had access to Camille's gown before she wore it? Margaret hesitated. Every piece is guarded, but in truth, too many. Seamstresses make final adjustments, stylists steam the fabric, the designer checks the fit. And Camille herself, of course. Security is strict, yet in the frenzy backstage, rules blur. Jessica nodded. The backstage world of fashion, though glamorous on the runway, was often chaos incarnate, pins scattered, fabrics draped over chairs, assistants scurrying under pressure. A clever hand could have slipped poison into a seam with no one the wiser. But which hand? The salon door opened abruptly, and a tall man in his late 40s strode in, flanked by two officers. His navy suit was cut with military precision, his hair slicked back until it gleamed. Inspector Laurent Girard, head of Paris's homicide division, introduced himself briskly. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, his voice carrying the authority of a stage actor, we regret the tragedy of tonight. Until further notice, you will remain here as we examine the circumstances of Mademoiselle Rousseau's death. A ripple of discontent swept through the room, but none dared openly defy him. Girard's gaze swept the crowd, then landed on Jessica. Madame Fletcher, I have read your books. Murder, always, yes? He offered a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. Perhaps tonight you will allow the police to conduct the investigation without literary embellishment. Jessica smiled politely, though his tone carried a dismissiveness she had encountered countless times. Of course, Inspector. But sometimes a writer sees patterns where others see only noise. Girard inclined his head, unconvinced, before moving on. Jessica turned her attention back to her notes, undeterred. She had no intention of interfering directly, yet. For now, observation was her sharpest tool. An assistant suddenly darted toward Margaret, clutching a folder of sketch sheets. Madame Vaughn, the designs for tomorrow's showcase, you said to keep them close. She handed them over with trembling fingers. The folder slipped slightly, and Jessica caught sight of the contents, hand-drawn sketches, with notes scrawled along the margins in hurried French. The hems of gowns, the cut of sleeves, the arrangement of jewels, all meticulously detailed. Jessica's eyes lingered on the sketches before Margaret tucked them away. An idea struck her. May I? She asked. Margaret hesitated, then opened the folder for Jessica's inspection. Jessica leafed through the pages, her gaze sharp. Each sketch was beautiful, but more than that, they were blueprints. The hem patterns, the stitched designs, the very framework of garments. She recalled Camille's gown with its constellations embroidered across the midnight fabric. The sketch for that piece was near the back, marked Étoiles du soir. Stars of the evening. Jessica traced a finger along the sketched seam line, her mind whirring. Margaret, who decides how these hems are stitched? The designer, or the seamstresses? The designer sets the vision, Margaret explained quietly. But the atelier does the actual work. Stitches, beads, embellishments. Each is assigned to specialists. Then whoever poisoned Camille didn't just tamper at random, Jessica said thoughtfully. They exploited the stitch. They chose the hem, the very place where needle and thread meet fabric and skin. Margaret blanched. You mean it could have been anyone in the atelier? Or someone who studied their work closely enough to mimic it, Jessica added. Her eyes slid towards Sylvie Marchand, who now whispered fiercely with a pale young man Jessica assumed was her assistant. Sylvie's expression was taut with something between anger and satisfaction. If Camille had been her rival, Jessica wondered how deep that rivalry had cut. At that moment, Inspector Gerard returned. He held a small evidence bag in his hand, inside of which lay a scrap of midnight fabric, its edges frayed. We retrieved this from the gown, he announced. There is residue along the seam, something chemical. Our laboratory will confirm, but I suspect a toxic compound. Until we know more, no one is to leave Paris. The salon erupted in cries of protest. Designers wailed about ruined reputations, assistants sobbed into their hands, and photographers muttered about missed deadlines. Jessica remained calm, her mind already cataloguing suspects, Alain with his temper, Sylvie with her ambition, Henri with his anxious guilt, and perhaps others she had not yet considered. She closed the sketch folder and returned it to Margaret, her voice low but firm. This was no crime of passion. It was planned, calculated, and stitched with precision. The key lies not just in who hated Camille, but who understood how a single stitch could become lethal. Jessica glanced again around the room. Every face wore a mask, of shock, of fear, of innocence. But behind at least one mask lurked the hand that had threaded death into couture. And Jessica Fletcher intended to unpick it, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 3, Rivals in Silk. The following morning, Paris awoke beneath a veil of scandal. Newspapers splashed Camille Rousseau's collapse across their front pages, headlines alternating between grief and outrage. Runway tragedy at Palais Garnier, couture turns deadly, poison at Paris Fashion Week. Paparazzi lingered outside hotels, their lenses hunting for the tear-streaked faces of models or the strained smiles of designers forced into damage control. The city that celebrated beauty had become obsessed with death overnight. Jessica Fletcher sat at a corner table in the Hotel Ritz dining room, a pot of coffee steaming beside her. She skimmed the French papers with practiced efficiency, translating the essence even when she didn't catch every word. Most reports repeated what the police had already stated: Camille had collapsed suddenly, medical help had come too late, and investigators were treating it as suspicious. None yet used the word murder. Jessica suspected Inspector Gerard preferred to control the narrative until he had evidence he could brandish before the public. Margaret Vaughan joined her at the table, her usually bright demeanor dulled by fatigue. I barely slept, she confessed, pouring herself coffee with trembling hands. The phones haven't stopped ringing. Journalists, buyers, even my husband in New York. Everyone wants to know if fashion itself is unsafe now. Jessica, this will ruin careers. Jessica folded the paper. It will certainly expose rivalries. And where there are rivalries, there are motives. As if on cue, a trio of familiar figures swept into the dining room: Alain Dubois, Sylvie Marchand, and Henri Beaumont. They had been seated together by the maitre d', though their stiff posture suggested anything but camaraderie. Alain ordered an espresso with a snap of his fingers, Sylvie adjusted her emerald scarf with calculated elegance, and Henri picked nervously at his croissant. Jessica leaned toward Margaret. What can you tell me about them? Beyond what I observed last night. Margaret sighed. Alain Dubois is brilliant but volatile. He's been in the industry for decades, yet his temper has cost him partnerships. Sylvie Marchand, she's the rising star. Critics say she's poised to replace Camille as the face of French glamour. And Henri Beaumont? He's the quiet genius in tailoring. He's worked for nearly every major house, but he's shy of the spotlight. Jessica's gaze lingered on Sylvie, who seemed almost too composed. The young designer's lips curved in a faint smile as she scrolled through her phone, as though yesterday's death had cleared her path rather than shaken her world. And Sylvie's rivalry with Camille? Fierce, Margaret admitted. Camille had refused to walk in Sylvie's shows, preferring older houses. Some say Sylvie resented that deeply. Last year, there was an incident. Camille reportedly called Sylvie's gowns derivative during a backstage interview. It spread through the industry like wildfire. Jessica's pen hovered over her notebook. Words can wound reputations. But would Sylvie go so far as to wound with poison? Margaret looked uneasy. I don't want to believe it. But in this business, envy is as sharp as any blade. Jessica decided to test the waters. Rising from her seat, she approached the rival's table with a gracious smile. Bonjour, Mes Amos. May I? Without waiting for refusal, she settled into an empty chair. Alain glowered. This is not a book club, Madame Fletcher. We are discussing private matters. Private matters often shed light on public tragedies, Jessica replied evenly. Tell me, did Camille have many enemies? Sylvie's eyes glittered like cut glass. Camille had admirers and detractors, as all icons do. But enemies? None. Only those jealous of her success. Jessica tilted her head. And were you among them? Sylvie's smile did not falter. Jealous? Hardly. Camille was a model, not a designer. Her fame was borrowed, stitched from others' genius. Unlike some, I do not envy mannequins. Henri shifted uncomfortably. Please, Sylvie. The woman is dead. Show some respect. Alain slammed his cup onto its saucer. Respect? For a diva who treated staff like servants? Bah! Camille was adored by cameras but despised backstage. She humiliated assistants, demanded impossible alterations. Perhaps her death is divine justice. Jessica studied him carefully. His fury seemed genuine, but fury could be both mask and motive. And yet, she said softly, justice rarely chooses such precise methods. Poisoning a gown requires patience, skill, and knowledge. Someone stitched death into her hem. That suggests planning, not passion. Henry's hands tightened around his fork. Poison in the hem? Mon Dieu, that is monstrous. But only a handful of us even touched that gown. Myself, 2 seamstresses, the stylist. He stopped abruptly, realizing he might be implicating himself. Jessica leaned forward. Then perhaps the truth lies in your atelier, Monsieur Beaumont. Before Henri could reply, Inspector Gerard appeared in the doorway, his presence slicing the tension. He strode to their table. Madame Fletcher, he said sternly, I must remind you again, leave the investigation to the police. Jessica smiled sweetly. Of course, Inspector. But you might find that people sometimes speak more freely to an author than to a detective. Gerard's jaw tightened. Perhaps. But I warn you, if you meddle further, I will have you escorted out of Paris Fashion Week. Jessica returned to her seat, undisturbed. Margaret looked at her anxiously. What did you learn? That Camille's world was full of rivals and resentments, Jessica said, jotting notes. Alain's anger, Sylvie's ambition, Henry's nervous guilt. Each wears a different fabric of motive. But one of them, or someone close to them, wove death into a gown. Margaret shivered. Jessica, what if the killer strikes again? Jessica closed her notebook. Then we must ensure the next stitch is pulled before another life unravels. She glanced toward the designer's table once more. Alain argued bitterly, Sylvie's smile widened like a blade, and Henri stared into his coffee as though the dark liquid might hide his secrets. The fashion world might parade beauty before flashing cameras, but Jessica knew, beneath the silk and sequins, uglier threads were at work. And she intended to follow them, stitch by deadly stitch. Chapter 4, The Atelier's Secrets. That afternoon, the air in Paris carried a restless energy. Crowds of tourists thronged the boulevards, but Jessica Fletcher walked in the opposite direction of the glamour. Margaret had arranged for her to visit the atelier where Camille's gown had been made, a chance, Jessica hoped, to trace the poison stitch back to its origin. The atelier sat in a quiet courtyard off Rue Saint-Honoré, its discreet brass plaque at odds with the grandeur of the garments inside. Jessica pushed open the glass door and was met by a soft rush of scent, freshly pressed linen, chalk, and faint perfume. Inside, the space resembled a sanctum of fabric. Bolts of silk and lace lined the walls, tables were cluttered with scissors and patterns, and mannequins stood draped in half-finished gowns. Seamstresses worked in silence, their needles flashing in the light, their concentration absolute. A middle-aged woman approached, her expression stern but professional. "Madame Fletcher? I am Colette Durand, maître couturière. Margaret said you might visit. I assume this is about the tragedy." Jessica inclined her head. Yes. Camille Rousseau's gown was extraordinary, but also, tragically, lethal. I wondered if I might see how it was constructed. Colette hesitated, then led her to a corner where a mannequin stood draped in a near-complete replica of the midnight gown. "We are remaking it for the archives," she explained. "But the original, of course, is with the police." Jessica studied the garment closely. The hem shimmered with constellations, each star a bead carefully anchored by silver thread. She bent closer, noting the tightness of the stitch. "Exquisite," she murmured. "Tell me, who worked on the original hem?" Colette's face darkened. "That would be Odette, one of our apprentices. She has nimble fingers and a steady hand. But she has not returned to work today." Jessica's brow lifted. "Has she given a reason?" Colette shook her head. "She sent word she was unwell." "Convenient, no?" Jessica kept her tone neutral. "May I see her workspace?" Colette guided her to a small table near the back. Spools of thread were stacked neatly, but Jessica's keen eyes spotted something out of place, a scrap of fabric tucked beneath a pin cushion. She lifted it carefully. The square bore a faint discoloration, a residue not unlike what Jessica had noticed on Camille's gown. She sniffed cautiously, there was a sharp, chemical tang beneath the cotton. "Interesting," Jessica said softly. At that moment, the door to the atelier banged open. Inspector Gerard entered, flanked by two officers. His sharp eyes locked on Jessica at once. "Madame Fletcher," he barked, "must you be everywhere?" Jessica tucked the fabric scrap into an evidence bag Colette offered. "I go where the truth leads, Inspector. And the truth may be hiding among the stitches." Gerard scowled but motioned for one officer to take the scrap. He turned to Colette. "This apprentice, Odette. Where is she?" "I do not know," Colette replied firmly. She was devoted to her work. But now? She vanishes the very day suspicion falls. It looks bad, Inspector. Gerard muttered something under his breath and made notes. Jessica, however, wasn't convinced. An apprentice might fear blame, but such fear did not necessarily mean guilt. As the inspector questioned seamstresses, Jessica wandered further into the atelier. She noticed pinned sketches along the walls, designs marked with notes in several hands. Among them was the étoiles du soir gown. Someone had scrawled a line near the hem, modify, plus Sarah. Modified, tighter. The handwriting, she realized, was not the same as the other annotations. She beckoned Colette. Who wrote this note? Colette frowned. Not Odette. She writes in block letters. This is cursive, elegant, practiced. Jessica's mind ticked. Could the poison have been introduced during this so-called modification? And if so, by whom? Leaving the atelier, Jessica walked with Margaret beneath the grey Parisian sky. Margaret was subdued. If Odette tampered with the dress, the police will stop here. But my instincts say otherwise. Mine too, Jessica said firmly. That scrap of fabric was planted too obviously. And apprentices don't leave elegant notes about modifications. They paused at a café terrace. Jessica pulled out her notebook and sketched a quick timeline. Camille's gown was altered at the last minute. Whoever made that adjustment had access not just to thread but to chemicals. Which narrows the suspects to someone both creative and calculating. Margaret leaned forward. Sylvie Marchand? Perhaps, Jessica allowed. Or Alain Dubois, his arrogance hides cleverness. Even Henri Beaumont, with his tailoring knowledge. Each could have written the note. She tapped her pen. But we mustn't leap ahead. Evidence, not speculation, will guide us. That evening, Jessica returned to her hotel room. She spread out her notes, Camille's collapse, the poisoned seam, the apprentice's disappearance, the rivalries. Something nagged at her. The phrase plus Sarah. Why tighten the hem? The gown had flowed flawlessly. Unless the change wasn't aesthetic, it was functional. A tighter stitch might hold something concealed. Her phone rang. Margaret's voice quavered on the other end. Jessica, you won't believe this. Sylvie Marchand just announced she's dedicating her next show to Camille. She's already speaking to the press, playing the grieving colleague. Jessica's eyes narrowed. So quickly? That sounds less like grief and more like strategy. She hung up, staring out at the Paris skyline. Lights glittered against the Seine, a city alive despite scandal. Somewhere among its towers and runways, someone was celebrating a rival's death. And tomorrow's Fashion Week events promised another stage, another opportunity for ambition to turn lethal. Jessica pressed her notebook shut. The atelier had revealed its first secrets, but the fabric of truth was far from complete. The stitch that killed Camille was tightening around someone's neck, and Jessica intended to pull until it snapped. Chapter 5, Shadows Behind the Spotlight. The following evening, the Grand Palais Éphémère hummed with nervous anticipation. Despite the tragedy, Fashion Week continued, though now every step down the runway was shadowed by fear. Security was doubled, journalists swarmed the entrance, and whispers of poison trailed through the crowd like perfume. Jessica Fletcher, seated with Margaret near the front row again, felt the tension radiate from the designers and models alike. Gone was the confident strut of the previous nights, the young women backstage now carried themselves with cautious poise, glancing constantly at their garments as if each thread might conceal danger. Jessica scanned the audience. Alain Dubois was here, brooding in a corner seat, his dark eyes sharp as blades. Sylvie Marchand, draped in crimson silk, smiled and waved to photographers with practiced grace, though Jessica noticed the stiffness in her jaw. Henri Beaumont lingered behind the curtain, fussing with garments, his movements quick, nervous. The show began. Models walked in deliberate procession, their gowns breathtaking, though the audience clapped with restraint, as though applause might summon catastrophe. Jessica's eyes remained on the garments, watching the hems, the bodices, the stitching. Every bead seemed suspicious now. Halfway through, a hush fell as Inspector Gerard strode into the hall with several plainclothes officers. He stood against the wall, arms crossed, his gaze locked on the runway. Jessica knew his presence was no mere show of force, he expected the killer to reveal themselves under pressure. When the final model walked, the applause was genuine, though tinged with relief. No one had collapsed. No poison had claimed a second victim. Yet Jessica sensed the undercurrent of danger had not lessened, it had merely shifted. Afterward, Margaret tugged Jessica toward the backstage area, where chaos reigned once more. Assistants rushed to undress models, journalists pushed for quotes, and designers bickered in low tones. Jessica slipped between groups, her eyes sharp for details. In a corner, she found Henri Beaumont bent over a sketchbook, his pencil scratching furiously. Jessica approached. "Working so soon after a tragedy, monsieur?" Henri startled, nearly dropping the book. I sketch when nervous. It helps me think." Jessica's gaze fell on the page. He had drawn Camille's gown, not the version that had graced the runway, but an earlier design, with looser hems. "Curious," she remarked. "You've captured it before the modification. Why omit the tighter hem?" Henri flushed. "Because that change was not mine. I argued against it, in fact. The dress needed no adjustment." Jessica's pen flicked across her notebook. "So who insisted?" He hesitated. A note arrived with the gown. It bore Sylvie Marchand's signature. Jessica's pulse quickened. Sylvie again. But before she could question Henri further, a shrill cry rang out across the room. A young model stumbled against a mirror, clutching her arm. Panic erupted, assistants rushing toward her. Jessica moved quickly, parting the crowd. The model trembled, but she was not dying, merely shaken. Her arm bore a faint rash, red welts against pale skin. "What happened?" Jessica asked gently. The girl pointed to her gown. "It burned. When I put it on, the fabric stung me." Jessica leaned closer. A faint powder clung to the seam near the shoulder, almost invisible in the dim light. She touched it with a tissue, again, that chemical tang. "Inspector Gerard," she called. Gerard arrived, his face stormy. "Another attempt?" Jessica nodded. "The same poison, applied differently. Not enough to kill, perhaps, but enough to test." The inspector barked orders, officers seizing the gown and escorting the frightened model away. The backstage murmurs swelled into a roar, fear, accusations, speculation. Jessica, however, stood still, her mind racing. 2 poisonings, both involving altered stitches. One fatal, one experimental. This was no impulsive act, it was a pattern. Someone was testing methods, refining their craft. Jessica sought Sylvie in the crowd. The young designer spoke to a journalist, her tone smooth, almost rehearsed. When Jessica approached, Sylvie lifted her chin. "Do you accuse me again, Madame Fletcher? How tedious." Jessica smiled softly. "Not accuse, observe. You dedicated tonight's show to Camille. A touching gesture. But gestures can be masks. And masks often hide the truth." Sylvie's eyes flashed. "You write mysteries. You see villains everywhere. But fashion is about beauty, not death." "Perhaps," Jessica replied evenly. "Yet last night's beauty killed a woman. Tonight's beauty nearly harmed another. It seems someone in this world prefers stitches of venom to stitches of art." Sylvie turned away sharply, her poise cracking for only a moment. Jessica filed the reaction in her mind. Later that night, back at her hotel, Jessica spread her notes across the desk. She drew a triangle: Camille's gown, the apprentice Odette, the modification note bearing Sylvie's name. Then she added another point: tonight's poison seam. 4 threads of evidence, all leading toward the same circle. But she hesitated. It was too obvious. Too clean. Whoever was behind this might be using Sylvie's ambition as a smokescreen, planting her signature to draw suspicion. If so, who gained by framing her? Alain, with his fury at Camille? Henri, with his guilty knowledge? Or someone else, hidden in the wings? Jessica closed her notebook. One thing was certain: the killer was growing bolder. And unless the truth was revealed soon, Paris Fashion Week would not end with applause but with another coffin. She looked out at the glittering lights of the Eiffel Tower, the city's beauty undiminished by scandal. Yet beneath that brilliance, Jessica knew, a shadow lurked, sharp, calculated, and lethal. And she intended to shine a light straight through it. Chapter 6: The Designer's Alibi. Morning sunlight streamed into Jessica Fletcher's hotel suite, catching on the gilt mirror and scattering soft rays across her notes. She had barely slept, her mind replaying the images of Camille's final moments and the rash on the young model's arm. 2 poisoned garments in as many nights meant escalation. Whoever had threaded death into couture was not finished. Jessica brewed tea and spread her notes across the desk. Camille Rousseau's gown, the apprentice Odette's disappearance, the cryptic modification note, the staged dedication by Sylvie Marchand, and now the rash-inducing fabric. Patterns were forming, but too neatly, as if someone wanted the threads to weave toward Sylvie. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Inspector Gerard, flanked by 2 officers. His expression was tight, his usual authority underlined by fatigue. "Madame Fletcher," he said, stepping inside uninvited, "I thought it best to speak privately. Last night's incident has forced my hand. I intend to bring Sylvie Marchand in for questioning." Jessica poured him tea without asking. "She certainly attracts suspicion. But don't you find it troubling, Inspector, that the evidence points so directly at her? Too directly?" Gerard raised a brow. "Poison in garments, a note bearing her name, rivals who profit from Camille's death, it is enough to justify an arrest." Jessica shook her head. "It is enough to justify suspicion. But not guilt. We must ask who benefits most. Sylvie is ambitious, yes, but would she jeopardize her entire career in so public a manner? Poison in front of cameras? That is not ambition, it is self-destruction." The inspector sipped his tea, scowling. "Then who, Madame Fletcher, do you suspect?" Jessica closed her notebook. "Let's speak with Alain Dubois." His temper has already betrayed resentment, and resentment, when coupled with genius, can be dangerous. They met Alain at his private studio near Montmartre. The place was equal parts atelier and theater, filled with bold sketches plastered on walls, bolts of fabric cascading across divans, and mannequins draped in outrageous gowns. Alain himself appeared in a velvet smoking jacket, cigarette holder poised like a conductor's baton. "Ah, the American authoress," he sneered when Jessica entered. "And our relentless inspector. To what do I owe this intrusion?" Jessica smiled politely. "We wanted to ask about your whereabouts on the night before Camille's final show. Specifically, whether you were present in the atelier when her gown was altered." Alain exhaled a plume of smoke. "Altered? Nonsense. That dress was perfection. Only a fool would touch it." Gerard stepped forward. "We have testimony that a modification note was found on the sketch, signed with Sylvie Marchand's name. Did you see it?" Alain's laughter was sharp. "Sylvie? She could not design her way out of a paper bag. If her name is on such a note, it is either forged or a childish prank." Jessica studied him carefully. His words were biting, but his eyes flicked, just briefly, toward a worktable cluttered with brushes and ink. She walked over. Among the sketches, she spotted a calligraphy set, the pen tip still stained with dried black ink. The script beside the inkwell, written on a discarded scrap, matched the flowing cursive she had seen on the gown's modification note. She lifted it gently. "You enjoy calligraphy, Monsieur Dubois?" Alain stiffened. "For my designs, yes. Precision matters." Jessica's tone softened. "Indeed it does. But precision also forges convincing signatures. One might even mimic another's handwriting with practice." The designer's nostrils flared, but he forced a smile. "An interesting theory. Do you accuse me, Madame Fletcher, of framing that little upstart Sylvie?" Jessica slipped the scrap into an evidence bag. "I simply observe that your skill allows you to do so." Gerard's jaw clenched, but Alain waved dismissively. "Believe what you like. On the night in question, I was at Le Chardon Rouge, a restaurant, with 3 companions. They will swear to it. I could not have touched the gown." Jessica asked gently, "And these companions, friends, or employees?" "Both," Alain admitted with a shrug. "They dine at my table every week. If you think their loyalty is evidence of guilt, then you misunderstand fashion. Loyalty is currency." As they left the studio, Gerard muttered, "The man is insufferable, but he may be right about the alibi." Jessica walked in silence for a moment. An alibi is only as strong as the loyalty of those who provide it. If Alain bought their silence, then his story may hold, but only on the surface. That evening, Jessica attended a private reception hosted by Margaret Vaughan. The American designer hoped to rally support among buyers shaken by the scandals. The reception sparkled with chandeliers and clinking glasses, but Jessica's attention was not on the gowns displayed, it was on the conversations swirling in corners. She overheard whispers about Camille's relationships with designers. One model claimed Camille had threatened to walk out of Alain's show last season. Another murmured that Henri Beaumont had been closer to Camille than most realized, closer, perhaps, than professional boundaries allowed. Jessica slipped onto the balcony for air, her mind sorting the fragments. Alain's calligraphy, Sylvie's rivalry, Henry's nervous sketches, Odette's vanishing act. Each was a thread, but who had woven them together? Inspector Gerard joined her. "You look troubled, Madame Fletcher." "I'm troubled because every suspect holds a motive, yet the design of this crime feels deliberate. As though staged to be discovered. Gerard folded his arms. You think the killer wants us to look in the wrong direction? Yes, Jessica said softly. And they're succeeding. We're chasing shadows while the truth hides in plain sight. The inspector regarded her thoughtfully. Then perhaps you should trust your instincts, Madame Fletcher. My men will continue with evidence. But you, his lips twitched in reluctant respect, you see patterns others miss. Jessica smiled faintly. Then let's hope the next pattern reveals itself before another model pays the price. She looked back into the reception, where Alain laughed too loudly, Sylvie posed too gracefully, and Henri lingered too nervously. Somewhere among them, the real designer of death waited, confident in their disguise. But Jessica Fletcher had unraveled enough mysteries to know, no disguise holds forever. Chapter 7, The Poison Thread. The rain fell hard over Paris that night, hammering against the glass roof of the Grand Palais Éphémère. Thunder rolled across the city, echoing like drums of war, as if the heavens themselves disapproved of the spectacle continuing despite Camille Rousseau's death. Yet the world of fashion, unyielding in its pursuit of attention, pressed on. Jessica Fletcher stood backstage, invited by Margaret Vaughan under the guise of moral support. In truth, Jessica wanted proximity to the garments, to the sketches, and to the suspects. She had learned long ago that killers often betrayed themselves when forced into proximity with their own crimes. Backstage was a battlefield of fabric. Models stood in slips, hair pinned, makeup freshly painted, while seamstresses scurried to make last-minute adjustments. Steam rose from irons, scissors clinked against metal trays, and assistants whispered frantic instructions. Despite the chaos, Jessica noticed how everyone's eyes carried a quiet dread. No one touched a gown without double-checking, no hem was stitched without paranoia. Poison had transformed this sanctum of beauty into a chamber of fear. Jessica's eyes fell on Henri Beaumont. The tailor hunched over a mannequin, tightening a bodice with meticulous care. His face glistened with sweat, and he jumped at every sound. Jessica approached. You seem unsettled, Monsieur Beaumont, she observed gently. Henri gave a nervous laugh. Unsettled? Who would not be? Death stalks our atelier. I cannot bear to see another girl harmed. Jessica leaned closer. Then perhaps you can help prevent it. Did you handle Camille's gown the night before the show? Henri swallowed hard. Yes. I pressed the seams, checked the hem. But I swear, madam, I never added anything. I loved Camille. He stopped abruptly, color rushing to his face. Jessica raised her brows. Loved? His eyes darted to the floor. We were close. She confided in me. But it was never public. Camille valued her image too much to be seen with a mere tailor. Jessica's pen hovered above her notebook. A secret relationship introduced new layers, motive, vulnerability, perhaps even jealousy. Did she mention fears? Enemies? Henri hesitated. She feared Alain. He pressured her to model for him again, but she refused. She told me he threatened to ruin her reputation. Camille laughed it off, but I saw the worry in her eyes. Before Jessica could press further, a sudden shout cut through the din, "Stop! Don't touch that gown!" A young dresser stood frozen, her hands hovering over a pale gold dress. Inspector Gerard stormed forward, flanked by 2 officers. He seized the gown and held it under the light. Along the seam shimmered a faint crystalline dust. Jessica moved closer, her breath catching. The same poison. Applied in a new place. Gerard growled, "This has gone far enough. Someone here is testing methods, perfecting them." The models gasped, some covering their mouths. Panic threatened to sweep the room, but Jessica raised her voice. "Please, remain calm. Fear will only give the poisoner power." Her eyes scanned the room, catching every flicker of reaction. Alain Dubois smirked as if amused by the chaos. Sylvie Marchand pressed a hand dramatically to her heart, glancing toward cameras that had already begun flashing. Henri wrung his hands, whispering prayers under his breath. Gerard ordered the gown confiscated, but Jessica knew theatrics wouldn't end this. The killer was emboldened, reckless now. They had nearly harmed again tonight. Why so brazen? Unless they wanted the world to watch. Jessica stepped aside, scribbling in her notebook. Poison applied multiple times. Each in a seam. Requires access, precision. Motive, rivalry, love, vengeance, or distraction. Her eyes narrowed on Alain's calligraphy. The note, forged in Sylvie's name, had directed suspicion cleanly toward the ambitious rival. Too clean. She turned to Gerard. "Inspector, may I see the evidence bags from last night?" Gerard frowned but nodded to an officer. The bags were brought out, Camille's poisoned hem, the scrap of fabric from the atelier, the golden gown seized tonight. Jessica studied them closely. With a magnifying lens borrowed from a makeup artist, she noted something striking. The residue glittered faintly, but differently. Camille's hem bore a dark sheen, while the golden gown shimmered faintly green. She looked up sharply. "These are not identical compounds. They are variations." Gerard frowned. "So? Still poison?" Jessica's mind whirred. "Yes, but variations suggest experimentation. Someone is adjusting the formula each time. Testing potency, contact, absorption. Camille's dress wasn't an accident, it was the first successful trial." The inspector swore under his breath. "You mean this is a scientist, not a seamstress?" Jessica tapped her notebook. "Or someone with knowledge of chemicals. A designer obsessed with control. A tailor with precision. A rival who wants not just fame but perfection." Her eyes drifted again to Henri Beaumont. He was pale, trembling, yet his tailoring knowledge was undeniable. Could grief mask guilt? Or was he a pawn, framed through his proximity to Camille? Jessica closed the lens. "Inspector, I believe we're chasing a hand that knows both fabric and formula. And whoever it is, they are not finished." The show eventually resumed under tight police supervision, gowns checked and rechecked, models trembling as they walked. No one collapsed, no further poison was found. But the air remained thick with unease. Later, Jessica and Margaret walked along the Seine, rain-slick cobblestones glowing under street lamps. Margaret sighed. "It feels like the killer is always one stitch ahead." Jessica tucked her notebook into her bag. "Not ahead, merely bold. Boldness leaves traces." And tonight, they revealed something crucial. Margaret glanced at her. "What?" Jessica's voice was firm. "They don't just want Camille silenced. They want fashion itself shamed. These poisons aren't only murder weapons, they're statements. Whoever stitched them is sending a message." They paused on the bridge, the Eiffel Tower glittering in the distance. Margaret shivered. "And what happens when the message is finished?" Jessica's gaze hardened. Then the curtain falls. Unless we unmask the designer of death before the final act. Chapter 8, The Last Stitch. The morning of the closing gala arrived with grim anticipation. Paris Fashion Week was meant to end in celebration, yet the mood was funereal. Reporters clustered outside the venue, eager for a statement, while models whispered prayers behind the curtain. No one knew if another gown had been seeded with death. Jessica Fletcher stood with Inspector Gerard at the edge of the runway, scanning the hall as guests filed in. Chandeliers gleamed overhead, photographers jostled for angles, and murmurs rippled like an undertow. The police presence was visible but discreet. Gerard hoped the killer might grow overconfident. Margaret Vaughn joined Jessica, clutching her arm. "Jessica, if another girl is harmed tonight, I don't know if the industry can survive it. Buyers are already canceling orders." Jessica gave her a reassuring pat. "Then it's fortunate we won't let that happen." Gerard turned sharply. "Do you know something I do not, Madam Fletcher?" Jessica's eyes glittered. "I know enough to set a trap. The killer thrives on spectacle. Tonight, they will not resist one final performance." The gala began. The orchestra struck a triumphant overture as the first models glided down the runway. Their gowns were checked, double-checked, yet still the audience watched with bated breath. Cameras flashed, recording every step. Jessica kept her gaze fixed on the designers lined against the wall. Alain Dubois smirked, arms folded, eyes glittering with disdain. Sylvie Marchand posed dramatically whenever a camera swept near, her grief for Camille painted with performative elegance. Henri Beaumont wrung his hands, watching each scene with an intensity bordering on panic. Halfway through the show, a model in a flowing sapphire gown faltered. A ripple of fear surged through the audience, but she recovered quickly, only her heel catching the fabric. Nervous laughter swept the hall, but Jessica noticed something the crowd missed: Henri Beaumont's sudden exhalation of relief, as though he had feared the gown would reveal something worse. Her suspicion tightened. When the final gown left the runway, applause erupted, relieved, jubilant, though faintly hollow. The lights dimmed, signaling the customary finale, designers stepping out to acknowledge the audience. Alain, Sylvie, and Henri emerged together, bowing stiffly. Their faces, lit by the spotlights, revealed layers of vanity, rivalry, and fear. Jessica rose from her seat. "Inspector, it's time." Gerard's brows knitted. "Time for what?" Jessica's voice was firm. "For me to unpick the last stitch." She stepped onto the runway, notebook in hand, her presence drawing immediate attention. Whispers surged through the audience, cameras swung toward her, and the orchestra trailed into silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jessica began, her calm voice carrying through the hall, "this Fashion Week will not be remembered for its gowns, but for its tragedies. Camille Rousseau's death was no accident. Her gown was poisoned, the stitch transformed into a weapon. And tonight, I will tell you whose hand guided the needle." The room froze. Jessica turned toward Alain Dubois first. "You, monsieur, had motive enough. Camille refused your shows, humiliated you with her independence. You forged Sylvie Marchand's signature on the modification note, hoping to cast suspicion. Your skill with calligraphy betrayed you." Alain's eyes blazed, but he held his tongue. She faced Sylvie Marchand. "And you, mademoiselle, stood to gain the spotlight left by Camille's absence. You embraced the cameras too quickly, played the grieving rival too smoothly. But ambition alone does not prove murder." Sylvie lifted her chin, defiant, though her hands trembled at her sides. Jessica's gaze settled last on Henri Beaumont. And you, Monsieur Beaumont. The quiet tailor. You claimed to love Camille, to protect her. Yet love can twist. When she rejected a future with you, when she laughed at Alain's threats but never took your devotion seriously, resentment bloomed. You alone had constant access to her gown. You stitched it, pressed it, adjusted it. And you alone understood how to lace poison into thread. Gasps rippled through the audience. Henry's face drained of color. Jessica pressed on. The compounds varied because you were experimenting, adjusting formula, testing strength. Camille's gown was the perfect trial. The rash on the second model, the crystalline powder on the golden dress, your refinements. You wanted precision, to control not just fabric but fate itself. And when suspicion turned towards Sylvie, you allowed it, even nurtured it. But you betrayed yourself in two ways. First, in your sketchbook, where you drew Camille's gown as it was before the modification. Only someone who disapproved of the change would preserve that version. And second, tonight, when the sapphire gown caught under a heel, you feared exposure, not an accident. That reaction revealed guilt. Henri staggered back, shaking his head violently. No. I loved her, I would never. Jessica's voice sharpened. You loved her too much. And when love was not returned, it curdled into something lethal. Your hands that once stitched beauty turned to stitching death. Inspector Gerard stepped forward, signaling his officers. Henri Beaumont, you are under arrest for the murder of Camille Rousseau. The tailor collapsed to his knees, his face a mask of anguish. She was supposed to be mine, he whispered hoarsely. If not in life, then in memory. No one else deserved her. The audience erupted, shouts, sobs, the furious snapping of cameras. Models clutched each other, designers shouted for order, but Jessica stood calm amid the chaos. Later, when the hall had emptied and Henri had been taken into custody, Jessica and Margaret lingered on the now quiet runway. The sequined gowns glimmered faintly under dimmed lights, ghosts of beauty haunted by violence. Margaret sighed heavily. So it was Henri all along. I pitied him, Jessica. He seemed so gentle. Jessica nodded sadly. Gentleness can conceal obsession. He loved Camille in his way, but love twisted by entitlement becomes dangerous. He believed if he could not have her, no one should. And in fashion, where every stitch is visible, he thought he could hide his crime in plain sight. Margaret shivered. Will Paris ever forget this? Jessica looked toward the darkened seats. Paris will recover. Fashion thrives on reinvention. But those who watched Camille's fall will always remember the night beauty was poisoned. And perhaps, she added softly, it will remind us that ambition and devotion, unchecked, can unravel into tragedy. Margaret touched her arm. And what about you, Jessica? Will you ever tire of solving murders? Jessica smiled faintly. Stories end, Margaret. But truth never does. Wherever it hides, in books, in gowns, in poisoned stitches, someone must reveal it. I only follow the thread. The orchestra pit lay silent, the runway bare. Yet Jessica Fletcher knew that while Paris would soon return to glamour and champagne, the echo of Camille Rousseau's last walk would linger like a shadow across the fabric of memory.